Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 58 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Mike, and that is Gavin. Hey, Gavin, we're doing this one a little bit earlier than normal.
We are. It'll still go out on Wednesday, but we're recording it a little early because it's going to be a little bit more of a technical sort of theory of science or more. No, not just talking about a group of animals or something like that. We're going to be talking about like a concept. So it's going to be very kind of abstract, kind of conceptual. And because of that, I want to be able to have the YouTube, portion of this episode up at the same time, which if we recorded our normal time, I can't really do. So if you have any questions at all during this, please go to the YouTube channel. You'll find it down below in the show notes. And ask your question there. That's probably the best way. Or, you can just, like tag us on Twitter where you should follow. You can find that down in the show notes as well. But like I said, it's going to be technical, but I think it's really important and something that I find really interesting and that at least somebody else finds somewhat interesting as well because it was requested. So this is another requested topic. So if you have a topic that you want us to share and us to talk about, there's a form for that down in the show notes. There's a lot of fun stuff down there. So definitely check out some of the things down in the show notes. But so today we're going to be
talking... Are you telling me this is going to be a little bit more intensive than the Velocipaster?
Just a little bit. Okay. Last week was a bit of a ride. If you managed to follow through it, good for you.
But that's something we like to do here. I think that's been a one thing I've enjoyed about this podcast is the kind of the ebbs and flows where we can have a really technical, serious episode, and we can also just review a bad movie, and it all kind of fits under the same umbrella, and I'm quite happy with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this episode is it was requested by Libris, who is somebody who I have had various interactions around the internet with. But so I'll read verbatim what they ask in the topic suggestion form. So it says, the question is, what topic ideas do you have? And it says taxonomy and cladistics. So taxonomy being why we name things the way we do, why humans are called Homo sapiens and such. And cladistics being how we know how related things are. So why we know that chimpanzees are the next closely related thing to humans, and then gorillas, and then orangutans, and so on. So the science behind how we make trees of life. And so they go on to say, I recently read Why Fish Don't Exist by Lulu Miller, which I looked up. It's a book, not one that I have read, but which includes a chapter about cladists, people who make trees of life, debunking fish as a category, and it got me thinking about how/why we name things. I think you've touched on some of it, like how birds are dinosaurs, but I'm interested in a more in-depth look at the reasoning behind it. I'd also like to learn more about what degrees of difference means something must be different. And they give the example of genus, family, etc. So we're going to talk about all of that in this episode. And
that sounds like quite a bit.
It is, but it's, I took an entire course in this, so we're not going to cram an entire course worth of stuff into an hour-ish podcast. But we're going to try to just sort of address some of those questions, why we name things, how we know certain things are related to each other, and a little bit of the history behind the practice of that.
So, all right. I'm already feeling a little bit overwhelmed, and I'm looking forward to getting the process broken down.
That's okay.
As we go through this episode.
And really quickly, before we get into the meat of it, it happened like a day before we recorded last episode, but it didn't seem to fit last episode's goofy nature. But friends of the pod, Nasaibo Raja and Dr. Emma Doon recently published a paper that I think they had mentioned in episode 33 when they were on the podcast, and you might also remember them from episode 52. They published a paper basically actually putting real concrete numbers to how like colonialism and past and well, frankly, current too, histories of colonialism affect paleontology, and actually putting like hard, concrete numbers instead of, just sort of theorying about it. So that paper is open source until the end of January. So we'll have a link to that down in the show notes as well. Anybody can go download it. I think it's really important. But it didn't really seem to fit the very unimportant nature of last episode. So
we're gonna have to get them back on to discuss that. I thoroughly enjoyed talking to them back on episode 33. If you haven't listened to that one, give it a shot because they are both just very engaging scientists.
Yeah, absolutely. So with that out of the way, taxonomy and cladistics. So we have talked about taxonomy directly in 2 episodes, episode 5 and 25, and we sort of touchingly talk about it in pretty much every episode. So like episode 56 about manatees, 2 episodes ago about manatees. So we talked, this family, the manatee family is Trichechidae, the dugong family is Dugongidae. And so why are those the names we give things? So that's what we're going to be talking about for this first part.
Okay.
And the big thing
before we begin, just what is taxonomy? Just like a definite, is it just how we categorize different species? Is that what we're doing?
So it is categorizing and naming is the important thing.
Okay.
So what most people are probably familiar with is Linnaean taxonomy. I'm positive, at least if you are in the United States, most of our education systems talk about this in like middle school to early high school biology. This would be your kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. That whole hierarchy. So that was created in, I believe, 1758 by Carolus Linnaeus, who was, I think, a Swiss or Swedish. I don't remember. I get them confused. But yeah, he was a scientist doing that kind of thing. And he was the first one to actually make a system of organizing and naming organisms that was very widely accepted throughout pretty much all of science. And
was it accepted right away, or was that one of those things that had to catch on over a period of time?
Pretty much. It was pretty much adopted right. Obviously it takes a little bit for stuff to be translated, but he published it in Latin. Because Carolus Linnaeus is like the Latinized version of his name. I don't believe that was his actual, given name. But so yeah, back in those times, if you published stuff in Latin, it was pretty widely available and was read pretty widely. So
okay.
So he published this in his extremely, extremely famous book called the Systema Naturae, or the System of Nature. And originally, he did all those steps, the kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Not all of them were there at first. So he only published and categorized things as kingdom, class, order, and genus, species. So he left out the
phylum, right?
Yeah, phylum and family. He did not have family either. Those were added in later for reasons that we'll talk about. And Linnaeus, even back then, said that genus and species were the only ones that he saw as quote-unquote godly, which today most people take as being reflective of nature. Different species look different. And for the most part, different genera, the plural of genus, look different as well. And behave different and function different in their ecosystems. But even way back, 250 years ago, he knew that the higher levels of his classification, the kingdom, class, and order, were just constructs that we use to help organize life and discuss life. Because those upper levels, and I've mentioned this before in a way that I don't think I did a proper job of explaining, because I don't think I had it in the notes, but this was something that I had struggled with when I learned it. So I really should have spent more time on it, but that's my bad. But so he knew that the upper levels are arbitrary.
Yeah, there's nothing inherent in nature that points to where those definite lines are. Like it's stuff that we made up just to help us explain things, if I'm correct, right?
Exactly. And so when I learned it, because to me, arbitrary means doesn't matter, which is sort of true and also sort of not true when it comes to naming things. So the example that I kind of thought up is in at least English, the language that I'm most familiar with, most nouns are arbitrary. For example, I'm going to use 3 fruit that most people are probably pretty broadly familiar with.
Say nouns are arbitrary?
And I'll get there.
I was going to say, I don't know what you mean by that, but go ahead.
So I'm going to use the examples of 3 different fruit. So blueberries. That makes sense that we call them blueberries because they're berries that are blue. Okay? That makes sense.
It's purpley, but all right. Well, I'll go with it. Grapes.
What about a grape says that should be called a grape? Nothing. Grape,
so is the
grape
difference
means grape
like,
because we call it a grape.
As opposed to like blueberry where like there is an adjective that informs the noun?
Right.
Okay.
And then as a further example, grapefruit, which, I mean, they got the fruit part, right? There's nothing about a grapefruit that says we should call it a grapefruit. They're not remotely similar to grapes. But we call it that because the word grapefruit is much easier than saying, oh, the big citrus fruit. It's shorthand for something else. That's what pretty much all nouns in English are shorthand for something else.
So is the point just that like we make up words, the only reason any words have meaning is because we have given them that meaning, if you go back up the tree far enough?
Exactly. And like language itself just kind of doesn't work if you don't give names to things. Because if you had to describe, say, a dog, if you had to describe what a dog was every time you talked about your dog, language kind of just falls apart. It's like, instead of saying a dog, you'd say, oh, this furry animal that lives in my house. And it's like, okay, well, what is an animal? Well, it's this organism that, whatever. Well, what's an organism? And you can kind of just follow it all the way up. So it's like we need to give names to things in order for language and conversation to have any kind of purpose.
Okay, fair enough.
It's also kind of arbitrary because life is a big spectrum. All of the lines that we draw are artificial. If you say you have a spectrum of light in front of you, so like a big rainbow. If you ask 1,000 people to say, point out red, orange, yellow, green, and blue, they'll all do it pretty much the same. But if you ask those same 1,000 people, draw the line between red and orange, between orange and yellow, they'll put it all in slightly different places.
This is kind of like the tennis ball question. Like, is a tennis ball green or yellow? And then, people will go argue about it forever.
Yeah, exactly. And so that spectrum, if you sort of think about life in that sense, where you draw the line only matters because if we don't have a set place to put it, if we don't have a set color that we call red and a set color that we call orange, then they bleed into each other too much and it's no longer useful to talk about them.
Mm-hmm.
So
we said we have to agree where the lines are before we can go any further, and it doesn't really matter where the lines are as long as we agree that the lines exist.
Exactly.
Okay.
So circling back to Linnaeus a little bit, Linnaeus published his book, and so this was actually the 10th edition of this book that he actually came up with this naming system in. He'd written this same book. It basically, how like college textbooks put out like a new edition every year, but only tweak like a couple things, and still somehow are like,
the new edition.
Hey, give me $800 now. But sort of like that, except Linnaeus actually put useful things in his new editions. So it took him 10 editions to add in this naming system.
Was Linnaeus a good dude? Like, he seems like a pretty cool guy from what you're describing here.
From as far as I can tell, I mean,
Okay.
I feel like realistically, or I'd say most white people living in the 18th century probably have some problematic stuff going on. But anyway, that's a different conversation. Uh,
Yeah, all right, fair enough. I wasn't sure if there was anything super obvious that,
Not that I know of.
like anybody that knows about Linnaeus, in addition to the other stuff, they also know about that time he did. But okay,
Not that I'm aware
fair
of.
enough.
Yeah.
Well, we can continue then.
So almost as if like it was meant to be this way. This was almost exactly 100 years before Darwin published On the Origin of Species. So by this point, we did not know about evolution, really. People had thought about it, but it was never as concrete and well formulated as Darwin would put it 100 years beforehand. So
Mm-hmm.
between Linnaeus and Darwin's times, that's 100 years of giving names to things that a lot of which are still in use today. Even though we don't use Linnaean taxonomy as it was written, we still use it as a base for things because, most people are familiar with, the term reptilia, reptiles and things, which we've talked about a bit before, why that doesn't quite work because, well, we'll get there when we talk about some of the problems with Linnaean taxonomy.
Right.
But the important thing for this span of 100 years is that people would categorize things and give them names based on similarity, but not at all based on ancestry, which is what we do now. So things that are more closely related are in the same group, whereas even if they're quite not similar, for example, Linnaeus put birds and mammals in the same group. He grouped them as more closely related than either of them are to reptiles because they're both, mammals and birds are both warm-blooded. They both have a four-chambered, more complex heart. So he thought because of those features, they should be in a group together without reptiles.
I mean, so I know it's not very scientific to do that, and we don't do it today. But could it be argued there's some value in doing that for more the common person to group things together based on just kind of outward characteristics as opposed to ancestry? Is there any kind of value to doing that, even if it's not like the world's most scientific thing?
I think there definitely is, and I think that's a big reason of why Linnaean taxonomy has hung around so long. Because we've known for at least 70 years at this point that it's not the most useful because of some of the errors we're going to talk about. So we've known that it's had its problems for a while, but things trickle out from the scientific consensus very slowly into culture. And if Linnaean taxonomy, if the only biology class that you take is your 9th grade biology and they only teach you kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, then you have no other way to be exposed to some of its potential problems and why it's not so used so much anymore. So because something that's a big thing that I see online a lot, because I'm in a number of paleontology Facebook groups, is people who argue that birds are not reptiles because reptilia is a class and aves, which is birds, is also a class. Because they are classes, they are at the same level and cannot be within each other.
Right, you couldn't have one. You couldn't. It's either binary. It's either or.
Right, which is not how it is, and we'll talk about that a little more in depth in a bit here. But another example that is, I think, much more relevant to pop culture, or I guess culture in general, is the term pachyderm, which we've talked about before, I think, in the elephants episode. But so pachyderm was a real group, or pachydermata, I think was the actual name of the group. Pachyderm just means thick skin. So this would be things that you would think of having thick, tough skin. This would be your elephants, hippos, rhinos. They were all put in the same group until, Darwin came along and we realized if we look at their ancestry instead of just their features, they should not be grouped together because they are ancestrally very, very different animals.
And so, like, they were grouped together for a period of time, and then, like, now they are not. Is that correct?
Right.
So, how does you might get here, but I am curious how that transition happens. How it's decided, okay, we're going to make this change, update all of your textbooks and models, and understand. Like, the transition is almost more what fascinates me. Is once a decision gets made, how does that wind up playing out in practice?
So, fortunately, a lot of that didn't have to happen because, for the most part, things that are more similar to each other are similar because they're related. So, when we got around, when Darwin, introduced us to natural selection and we started creating groups based on ancestry instead of just features, conveniently, things that have similar features often share a close ancestry, which is why a lot of the groups that Linnaeus and people around the same time as him, a lot of the groups that they introduced are still valid, still real groups, because, if even if you group things by similarity, most of the time that will also be by ancestry.
I mean, that seems like kind of a lucky accident then. So it's
A little
so
bit,
the
yeah.
changes that need to get made between the old school and the new school ways were more rare than you might than just by doing it randomly.
Yeah, so like
Okay.
the reason that like pachydermata comes up a lot when you talk about this kind of thing is because that's one of the big examples of this method really being wrong.
Mm-hmm.
That and like the bird and mammal stuff as well. But Linnaeus did a lot of really good stuff, and if you look up, the majority of like really common animals, a lot of their scientific names are named by Linnaeus. So like Linnaeus named Bos taurus, the genus and species for domestic cattle. Most animals like that, or even some exotic ones, because he would just send people out and have them bring him back stuff. So like tapirs, which are relatives of rhinos and horses. Those certainly don't live in where Linnaeus was. Today they live mostly in Central and South America, and I think there's one species in Indonesia. But he named at least the genus Tapirus. So he did a lot of good stuff that is still valuable today, but similar to a lot of things, in your wheelhouse like history, you can acknowledge the good work they did while also pointing out the problems.
It is hard not to do that with quite a lot of characters, is to say they are complex people. Let us take them as they come.
Right. So let's talk about some of those problems then that we now have with Linnaeus's work. So, as I pointed out before, some groups wound up within a group of the same rank. For example, that class Reptilia and class Aves. Both classes, yet by how we classify things today, Aves is within Reptilia. And that, for people who aren't used to thinking of these groups as a scientist who studies this kind of thing, that confuses a lot of people, because it's like they're both classes, they should be equal, but they're just not. And a great example that I found while making up my notes for this were two orders. So 2 episodes ago, in the manatees episode, we talked about the order Sirenia. So that is an order of mammals that has 4 living species today and somewhere around, I don't remember exactly, but 60-ish fossil members total. Whereas Coleoptera, which is the order of beetles, has over 400,000 species in it just living today, let alone the fossil ones.
That seems like a lot.
That's a lot. So having things on the same rank implies that they are similar in size.
But it very clearly does not.
Right. And it also implies a lot of other things of equality between them, such as, beetles have been around for, well over 100 million years, probably pushing closer to 200 million years. Actually, no, quite a bit longer than 200, because I'm actually thinking, because I read a paper recently about how they did across the end Permian mass extinction, which was 252 million years ago. So beetles have been
It's
around
a damn long time.
Yeah, they've been around for a really long time, whereas, as we talked about before, manatees have only been around for tops 55-ish million years ago. So one group is massively more diverse than the other one and has been around for a heck of a lot longer, but they're at the same rank. So in the eyes of most people, they're at the same rank. That implies some level of equality between them, when that is almost never the case. So this is all kind of summed up in a way that also is kind of tricky to wrap your head around, is that life is too diverse for Linnaean taxonomy.
I mean, that makes sense to me.
Right.
When you have, there's like one formula. This is how we are going to categorize things. And then you just like look around, you like step outside in a few different places and you're like, oh, that's a lot. Like it doesn't seem like we have enough levels.
Well, because I think people for a while tried to really hang on to using Linnaean taxonomy more than we do today, because I think there are it's something with a 7, so it's either 27 or 17 formal ranks within Linnaean taxonomy. So there are things like subspecies, subgenus, subfamily, superfamily, suborder, superorder, things like that. Levels in between each of the ones that you're more familiar with. But even with that, say it is the 27, that is still not even close to as diverse as you need to actually classify life properly. So for example, I went through, and I'm not going to list all of these because that would be bad content, but I went through and just started at the very top of human taxonomy. So this would be things like the group that is everything that's not bacteria, then everything that's not plants. So starting at the very, very tippy top, there are, and this was a total coincidence, there are 69 different stages. Different clades
Nice.
is what we would call those. So a clade is the term that we use instead of saying kingdom, phylum, class. A clade is just a general term for any rank or other group of life. And
when you have 69 different levels of something, it sort of becomes untenable to have that as your system. And this is just for humans, whereas various other species, I presume, could have many more or many less.
Well, and I guarantee that I missed some. Number one, and number two, in between each one of those, you could go all the way down to species, because each new group must originate from a particular population of a species. So like our family, Hominidae, must have evolved from a particular population of another species. So within each one of these, it could go all the way down to species, and then you go up to the order primates, and then you go all the way down to species and stuff like that. So this is unbelievably incomplete, and this is,
but it kind of goes back to that whole line drawing problem that we talked about at the beginning.
Exactly.
Like right? What are these levels even when you really start to get down to it?
Exactly. And they are important, and drawing the lines where we draw them, so for example, for humans, one of the big things that differentiates us from the other apes is that our spine meets our skull on the bottom. The hole where your spinal cord goes out from your skull into your spine is, points downward, whereas in other apes it points more backward. The bones in our skull have shifted a bit. That's one of the defining features. It doesn't have to be. Why we pick the features we do at the end of the day is kind of arbitrary. So there's also no reason why we call things. I shouldn't say no reason. The reason Homo sapiens is called Homo sapiens is because those words mean something. There's no reason that, Homo sapiens couldn't have been called something else.
Mm-hmm.
So that is a bit of why some of the groups that some of the problems with some of the groups that Linnaeus made, and the problem with doing this without fossils, because at this point they did not include fossils in this at all, because we didn't really understand that fossils were a really important part of this because they showed the ancestry. So let me walk you through a little bit of an example here.
Yeah.
Back in Linnaeus's time, if you were to compare a human, an elephant, a boa constrictor, and like a seagull, depending on what features you picked, would change how you would group those.
So, I mean, yeah, that makes sense. Like, depending on what you're focusing on and where you want to start.
Right. Yeah. So for example, if you did it based on warm blood, the human, the elephant, and the seagull would be grouped together, and the boa constrictor would be off by itself. If you did it based on laying eggs, the human, the elephant, and the boa constrictor would be together because boa constrictors do not lay eggs. They give live birth. Those three would be together, and the seagull would be off by itself. And if you did it based on teeth, then the elephant and the boa constrictor, you could argue, should be together because they both shed teeth constantly. As we talked about with elephants, they only have the one tooth in each part of their mouth, and they just constantly shed them throughout their life. So do boa constrictors. So those two would be together. Humans would be off to the side, and then birds don't even have teeth. So none of those are consistent with each other, nor are they correct. But when you put in the ancestry and follow the evolution of those traits, then it shows the truth that, birds used to have teeth, but they got rid of them. It shows that boas used to lay eggs, but they don't anymore. And elephants used to have normal mammal teeth, but they've since changed them. So you can't do what Linnaeus was trying to do without evolution. Questions?
Again, to me, this all kind of goes back to like the line drawing problems. Like I can actually follow this a lot better than I thought I would be able to, because at the end of the day, how there's a similar problem when it comes to coastlines that I won't bore anybody with. But basically, when you're trying to measure the length of coastlines, that number can actually change. The length of a coastline depending on how granular you want to get.
Right.
And you just need to agree exactly what you're using as your as your barometer, essentially. And it seems like it's the same thing here, where it's a useful tool to be able to teach kids how species and evolution and different species work. It's useful to help visualize it. But at the end of the day, those lines are a lot fuzzier than anybody would ever, think of. In part because, what do you focus on, like you were just talking about before, but also just, life is way too complicated than, life on Earth is too complicated for a one-size-fits-all system, as simple as it was made to be in my 7th grade biology class.
Right. Yeah. And that's something that my grad school advisor, who will hopefully be on the show at some point, said, as you go up in your education, it is more or less just a systematic refutation of lies.
I believe you've mentioned this a time or two before.
So when you were taught your kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, that was a little bit of a lie. That this is how it cleanly works. But
a useful lie. But still a lie.
Yes, a very useful lie, because if I were to throw all of this at a 9th grader, they would probably shut down immediately.
Right.
So I guess sort of wrapping things up a little bit here. We still have a little bit to talk about, but
let's do it.
To be a proper group under cladistics, which is the science, like I said, of making trees of life, you need to include an ancestor and all of its descendants. So, for example, humans are apes because if you go back to the first ape and include all of its descendants, that includes us. Whales are even-toed ungulates, things with hooves, because if you go all the way back to the first even-toed ungulate and look at all of its descendants, that includes whales. And similar story for birds being reptiles, same thing. And so that is something that a lot of people miss, because another piece of discourse, that I see a lot on different Facebook groups, because of course it's about dinosaurs, so everybody has strong opinions on it for some reason.
Just to make your blood boil a little bit more than it would already be. It's about dinosaurs.
Well, because people will also sort of, they'll like start to understand the concept, but they'll sort of turn it around and say dinosaurs aren't reptiles because birds evolved from them. So it's like they took the first step, but are just sort of almost refusing to understand it correctly.
Which is always extra frustrating.
Yeah. So birds are reptiles because dinosaurs are reptiles, and therefore birds are reptiles. So this is this method of creating trees and creating groups is why also things like snakes, which don't have legs, are tetrapods, which means 4-leg, because they used to have legs, but they just got rid of them. And circling back to Libris's suggestion, I believe the book that they suggested this topic off of was called Why Fish Don't Exist, which is interesting because we've definitely talked about this on the podcast before. So I think
I believe so. I believe we've mentioned it a time or two.
So we have talked about it in the sense that fish as a term, because if you're looking at fish as a group and include all of its descendants, that must also include humans, snakes, birds, dinosaurs, turtles, whatever. Anything with bones, essentially, is a fish. I guess the person who wrote that book made the argument that fish is a dumb term that we shouldn't use. And granted, I haven't read the book, so I don't know. But because it is so broad that it is meaningless. If fish includes everything from what you think of as a fish to humans, that term no longer is really useful to use. Right? Yeah. Is that sort of tracking?
Yeah, I mean, right. It's, what do we agree to call things? And, while it might be easy to look at a goldfish and say fish, all of those kind of outer permutations, or the penumbra, I think, to use a legal term, and a science term, is, it's where things start to get tricky. And, it doesn't matter exactly what we call things, but it matters that we agree.
Right. And I think fish is a great example of a place where no matter how much scientists say it, people will not change the way they speak. So I've said a number of times on this show that humans are fish. Technically, yeah, we are. But the public,
that's not useful, right?
The public will never do that, and I don't, honestly, nor should they.
Right,
because fish has a specific term in vernacular use instead of science use, and to take that away, I think, would just not be the right thing to do.
Right, it's not useful. How is to sort of take that in a different direction? So we talked about the public, or you just did. What about the scientific community? So there, if you were to say humans are fish and be technically correct and everybody in the public is looking at you funny, how is the scientific community? Is this something that is in a state of flux and a source of constant arguments? Is this something that they figured out decades ago and the public side is still trying to catch up? Like what is the state of all of this with regards to people that do it for a living?
So, I mean, we have known that, tetrapods, meaning things with 4 legs, um, evolved from fish. We've known that easily for probably close to 80 years at this point.
Wow.
So, and then that's when you get terms like, so if you were talking specifically about, fish, people who would talk about that would say non-tetrapod fish, or they would probably say like non-tetrapod osteichthyans, because that's the group of fish that we evolved from.
Mm-hmm.
And you hear that much more often when talking about dinosaurs, because as scientists, when they talk about dinosaurs, that dinosaur, the group, also includes birds. So to denote that you are not talking about birds, you say non-avian dinosaurs. That's probably the thing that people are most familiar with, because you'll see that a lot in Facebook groups and things talk about dinosaurs. And that's typically when people are like, why do you have to put non-avian dinosaurs? Birds aren't dinosaurs, or something to that effect.
Mm-hmm.
So the last point that I kind of want to talk about here is,
all right,
if this all works so well, because scientists by and large do agree on most places to draw lines. Nobody is really quibbling, where to draw the line primates. Nobody is really quibbling where to draw the line for crocodiles. It's mostly at the very fine scale that people kind of argue. So,
and that's the kind of thing you would almost expect. Like, it'd be hard to have a system where people didn't argue at the kind of nitty-gritty finer points, right?
Right. And so if this all works so well, why do scientists argue about things? Because there are very few exceptions. But like I said, for the most part, we argue about the small stuff. One of those exceptions is turtles, actually, because as we've mentioned before, turtles is the only fairly large scale group that we just kind of don't know where it goes.
Really?
Yeah.
And is that because it's in a group of its own, or because it could plausibly fit into several different groups?
It could plausibly fit into several different groups. And so turtles are very weird. They have a lot of features that nothing else has, which makes it really hard to figure out, looking back to that similarity. They are not similar to any other animals. So it is hard to figure out what they're related to. And then you sort of get a lot of the people who don't really understand genetics being like, well, why don't you just take DNA from everything and figure it out? Because that's something that our teacher at one point even asked us. He's like, why don't we do that?
I mean, that sounds one of those things that's just easier said than done. But like, if you conceivably had enough money and time, is that a thing that's possible? Or would that not yield the answer?
Both. So number one, even if we did have DNA from every living species on the planet, our computers are not strong enough to work that out in a reasonable amount of time. It would take decades and decades and decades. Because for each new sample, you have to compare that one sample to all the other ones. And at this point, we've got about 1 million species. And that's just animals, let alone all the plants, all the bacteria and things. And so if you did it with just the animals, our computers are not strong enough to do that, number one. And number two, DNA is weird because sometimes it changes slowly, it evolves slowly, but other times it evolves really fast.
What counts as really fast?
I mean, there are rates that you can look up, but so for example, in our Living Fossils episode, we talked about coelacanths. And coelacanths have changed very, very little over their fossil history, at least appearance-wise. And so we think that that's just because their DNA has a really low mutation rate. They reproduce really slowly. So there's just less of a chance for mutations to happen and then be passed on. Whereas things in, say, famously rabbits are very famously good at reproducing. So that just provides much more time and more generations for DNA to change. And so what can happen sometimes with DNA is that it can, if two groups are evolving slowly and one other group that's related is evolving really quickly, it can make those two evolving or those two slow groups look like they are more closely related than they are.
Just by comparison.
Right, because if they're both changing at a slow rate, they appear more similar to each other than this one who's evolving real fast and just changing real fast. So if it's changing a bunch of stuff, then that sort of artificially will make the computer think that the two slowly evolving ones are more closely related than they are. And it is almost like there are ways to do it if you're only working with a couple of groups, but it is almost impossible to suss that out if you're using a large sample size. So just go get DNA from everything is just not a viable solution. And this really becomes a problem when you're talking about things with, for example, snakes. We really don't understand a lot of which snake groups are more closely related to what others. The bigger scale stuff in snakes, like we know all the boas and pythons are over here. We know where all the venomous ones sort of sit. But with your regular sort of garden variety snakes, your garter snakes, and things like that, where each of those species and each of those genera sort of fit, we don't really know, because snakes evolve very quickly. And so it confuses the heck out of a lot of different methods that we currently have to do this.
It's the exception that's going to break the rule, whatever the rule is, it sounds like. Because if you have a system designed for most other things, you're still going to have a large minority that just don't play by those rules.
Right. And those ones that don't play by the rules really screw up the results from the rest. But you can't exclude them because they're still part of whatever group you're trying to study. So excluding them is just not something that, you're really allowed to do.
Is it a fool's errand, just the whole exercise of trying to organize and categorize everything?
No. That'll be my finishing point here. So
okay.
I'll circle back to that in a sec. And the biggest thing as a paleontologist that sort of bugs me with a lot of cladistics and things is that if traits don't fossilize and aren't found, we can't use their history in the trees that we make. So, for example, say in coelacanths, I know that they don't have a swim bladder, but pretend they do. If, they're evolving really slowly, the swim bladder is an organ that's, it's completely soft. That would not fossilize. And so if that changes, and say that potentially would be really important in classifying certain groups of coelacanths, we just wouldn't get it. That is information that is lost to time. And that is...
See, that's part of what makes me think this is a fool's errand. Like, you are not going to be able to have all the information to be able to do this. I don't know. I'm almost leaving this more pessimistic now. Just that it is, you might be able to get 60 or 70% of the way there, but there is just so much missing information.
Yeah.
That you will never quite... Even if you had a perfect system, you don't have all the information to make that system work properly.
Yeah, and I understand why that thought is there. I really do, and I definitely sympathize with that. But so my last bullet here is that there is one single right answer to the tree of life. Regardless of what people argues, there is a right answer to where each branch on the tree goes.
Right.
we will almost certainly never get there because fossils are generally uncooperative. But that doesn't mean that's not important to try, because it can really teach us things a lot about how the history of our planet and the history of life on our planet has gotten to be where it is today. And also where, by understanding patterns of evolution in the past, we can understand where evolution might go in the future, which is also potentially really important because we want to live in the world of the future. And with how humans are mucking everything up, the more we understand about the potential future, the better.
And that's always, important, just to have a better understanding.
Yeah.
That is worth doing just on its own.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I'll close with that. And I know that this might not have answered a ton of questions because, like I said, this is a graduate school level kind of concept. And I was taught it by people who have been teaching it for, decades, or, a decade or so. So clearly I have
but
not.
It opened up a lot of questions. That's what's I think important, is that this might not have answered a whole lot of questions, but it did, bring up a whole lot of questions that are hard to answer. And that's, that is almost just as worth doing than just to answer a bunch of questions. This, is exposing a lot of, even with me, this is just kind of exposing different ways of thinking about problems that don't have clean and tidy answers.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, like I said at the beginning, if you have questions and want them answered better than Google might provide, or at least have me do the Googling for you, check out the YouTube, and just if you have a question, just put it in the comments, or tweet at or DM the podcast Twitter account. You can find that down in the show notes as well. And I would be more than happy to address any kind of questions on this, because it's something that feels really important, but also really poorly understood by most people.
And if you've made it this far in the episode, even if you don't have any questions, it would make Gavin happy if you put one or two of them down there.
It sure would.
All right, is that it? Is that all we have on taxonomy?
I think so.
Good, because I'm not done. So, we are going to close today's episode with something that we normally do here at the beginning, but we wanted to put at the end just to make sure we got all the hardcore science out of the way. Today in history.
Yeah.
As we are recording this, we are doing this on Sunday, January 16th. There's a lot of snow coming in here to New York. I'm sure it is. I'm sure it's the same thing where you are right now.
Oh, it's totally. We got about 1/10 of an inch of rain yesterday, and it was about 65 degrees. So
we had wind chills down to -10 or 20, I think, over the weekend. It was a bit. So
yeah, I texted my mom yesterday, and I was just like, "Hey, how's the weather up there?" And she just replied, "Effing cold."
So in that spirit, for January 19th, so the day this episode comes out, in 1977, snow falls in Miami, Florida. This is the only time in the history of the city that snowfall has occurred there.
Interesting.
Yeah.
What year was that? 77?
1977.
Huh.
So yes, that was our Today in History to cap off what was a really informative episode, and it was not quite as out of reach as I would have expected. This is something that I think is graspable by a lot of people that have kind of a science brain or a science mind. And thank you, Gavin, for putting that all together for us.
Yeah, of course, buddy.
Awesome. So this has been episode 58 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. Make sure to head over to YouTube if you have not done that already, because Gavin will be down in the comments answering your questions. And we will see you all next Wednesday.